Hi, everyone. My name is Albert Park. I'm one of the members of the Adult Education Board, and I'm here today to introduce the speaker, Elizabeth Morrison. Elizabeth is the CEO and principal consultant of EM Consulting. The foundation of all of Elizabeth's work focuses on centralizing human connection in healthcare through development of integrated care systems, implementing trauma-informed care practices, and elevating the vital importance of skillful, empathetic communication both in person and virtually. She has dedicated her career to working for and with nonprofit safety net health organizations, including community clinics, Medicaid health plans, philanthropic health foundations, and other social justice-oriented nonprofits. Elizabeth has a PhD in social psychology, is a licensed clinical social worker, and has a master's in addiction counseling. As a practicing clinician for over 25 years, she has been engaged in providing therapy via video, phone, and text for the last 18 months, maintaining an on-the-ground perspective of what works in practice. Today, her talk is entitled, "When a Spirit Turns into a Marathon, Maintaining Mental Health Amidst the Pandemic." So we'll have a presentation and we'll have some little time for Q&A at the end. So welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much. Thank you for introducing me, and Jacob and Jen. I don't see Jen, but I'm guessing she's there. I just want to say thank you to both of you for asking me to talk this morning. I just wanted to say that I have the chat open, and so I'll for sure I'll stop and hoping that we can have a discussion. So we'll have time to talk. But also, if you're thinking of something, if something's in your mind and you want to get it into the chat, and you're one of the folks on Zoom, please feel free to do that. I know sometimes I'll think of things as someone's talking and I don't want to miss them. So please feel free to use that. I'm going to share a couple slides while I'm talking. I wanted to just say first that I've been to the church. I've been to Unity Church down there, and I attended a wedding for two members of the fellowship, and I was with my husband, and we hadn't been there before in person, and we were super early from our hotel, so we had coffee like a few blocks away. And then I did like a map quest to get there, and as we were sort of following, the GPS, my husband Chris said, "I think I see it." And I said, "How do you know?" And he said, "I see the pride flag." And so it just made me remember when I was going to be on here with you this morning, how much I appreciate the social justice orientation of the church, and what a beautiful space it is. And I also, maybe about a year and a half ago, sometime at the beginning of the pandemic, was able to come and talk at Jacob and Jen's invitation to some of you. And I had one other point of contact, and I can't remember what the group was called, but I know that one of the ministries is a group of lay counselors to assist folks. And I got to talk with that group as well. So all my connections have been so sweet, and I have so much respect for all of the work that you do down there. Faith in action it's really apparent. So very honored to be here this morning. This is my son, Dash. His name is actually Dashiell, kind of like Dashiell Hammett, the mystery writer who wrote like The Thin Man and The Maltese Falcon. When he was little, he used to, we told him that he wasn't really named after Dashiell Hammett, but we always told him that there was a well-known Dashiell, and it was Dashiell Hammett. So when he was little, he used to tell people his name was Dashiell Hammett, which is kind of a joke for a pretty narrow population. Stephen ministry, maybe it was Rick. Yeah, maybe it was it, but I'm actually going to talk about Today, I really wanted to focus on lay counseling. So I think it may have been. So Dash, he's adopted, and he has some difficulties around that, or some complexities that sometimes biological kids might not have to consider or think about. And he's a really anxious kid. So he, slept in our bed and then on the floor in our room up until the pandemic, when he was about 11, when the pandemic started. Lots of nightmares, and it was all sort of what we felt like within the family that we could really address. My husband's a counselor as well, so we always felt like we could manage it ourselves within the house. We had accommodations that we could make, and we could figure out ways to talk to him. And his sister sort of would pitch in and help. And then the pandemic hit, and without school and without seeing other kids, and especially when school started up virtually in the in the fall of 2020, his mental health declined so rapidly. It was like watching a plane crash and burn. I've never seen such a rapid mental health deterioration up close. And his anxiety became so severe that he had insomnia, like I've only seen adults struggle with, where he would not sleep the entire night and sometimes go into the next 24-hour period without sleep. He started to feel like he was seeing monsters. So when he looked outside at the shadows, he would, part of him would think that there were monsters out there. He got really depressed and started telling us that he didn't have any friends, and that he would say, I remember I had friends, but it's not real to me anymore. I can't see anybody. Like in his mind, he couldn't hold the friendships in his mind the way I think some of us as adults were able to. And as a result of that, for the first time in my life as a parent, we were desperately trying to find professional help for him. And we have commercial insurance. We're white. We have these factors that we know make access easier for us. We know that people of color, we know that people who are on public insurance, who don't have insurances, have a much harder time accessing mental health services. And still, when we know a bunch of people in the field between my husband and I, and the best we could do was we ended up on a 14-week wait list for a child psychiatrist in Sacramento that was going to be a telephone call. That was the best we came up with for professional help. So the reason I want to share that is, I'm a therapist and I work in the field and I see patients, and I feel like I have seen up close what the mental health impacts have been of the pandemic. And I think there's a layer about the pandemic. There's a layer of the sort of collective trauma that, as we've been watching the most recent sort of racial reckoning that happened after the George Floyd murder. There's, for us in California, there's the wildfires and sort of the existential, I think, feeling that provokes in many of us around climate change and sort of our new normal. But I know that I think, within the pandemic, when the air is terrible and we're advised to stay inside and we can't see the sun, I see, it has an impact on all of us to some extent. And so I think all of my patients that I've seen have come with those sort of that as the backdrop. And it was happening in our own house during this last year and a half as well. I wanted to share that before I shared some of these statistics that I'm guessing many of you know. Mental health is in the headlines, which it normally is not in the headlines. And in fact, it might be one of those just tiny silver linings that comes from this time in this global pandemic, is that we do see mental health in the headlines. In fact, at one time, I was taking screenshots every time I saw, a headline about mental health, because it was so surprising to me. It's really uncommon if we think about the health field as sort of the larger field. Mental health, or what we might say behavioral health, to include substance use conditions, is always just sort of a fraction, of the field, and it doesn't usually garner headlines. But yet it has. And I think one of the possible silver linings is that we're having these conversations more often. And, the federal government has earmarked billions of dollars to expand mental health services. And there's sort of been a highlighter marker drawn across the fact that access is so incredibly poor for mental health help. So that may be a silver lining. And you may know many of these statistics, at least in general, which is over half of us in the US, and this is mostly true worldwide, but over half of us are endorsing anxiety or depression symptoms. And fully 40% of us meet a criteria for an anxiety or depressive disorder over this pandemic time. There's been a 13% increase in substance use disorders. And I suspect that is much higher. I think many of us do. I'm going to talk a little bit in a few minutes about stigma around mental health. The stigma for substance use disorders is much higher in our culture. And so people tend to underreport substance use difficulties. But even with what we know is reported, there's been a 13% increase. And then probably what I find the most disturbing and frightening and sort of urgent statistic is that there's between a 25 and 50% increase in suicidal ideation in kids, so in 18 and under. And in fact, I've been working with a large health system that runs a lot of hospitals in Maine and Rhode Island and Vermont. They have a really large hospital system, and they saw a 50% increase in emergency room visits for actual suicide attempts during the last 18 months. So we were already in a suicide epidemic in this country. Suicide has been increasing hand over fist for the last 20 years. In kids of color between the ages of 10 and 15, suicide is actually the second leading cause of death. So particularly in young folks, we see it as inching up as a major cause of death. So really, we were there before the pandemic, and then we've just seen it skyrocket during the pandemic. So I wanted to spend most of our time today just on this question of what can we do? And I know that as an action-oriented fellowship, that you are doing things all the time as a fellowship. And the lay counselor program is just an example of that. And I imagine that there's a lot of informal work going on in terms of supporting the fellowship and people in your community. And I know individually, we may be doing things for ourselves. Some of us may be engaged in professional help around mental health or substance use disorders. Some of us may be doing all of the things that I'll mention before we end here that are sort of evidence-based assistance that is not professional help, but are ways that we can help ourselves or help others. So as after Jacob asked me to come here today, I just spent some time thinking, out of the sort of whole garden of all of those things, what would be one or two things that I could talk about that I felt like might be meaningful? And I decided to talk about this one sort of specific aspect that has been deeply helpful for us and our family around my son Dash, and is also something that I work on myself internally, but that also I do a lot of work professionally around. And that is really around the intervention of listening. the power of deep listening to others and deep listening to ourselves. So the first thing that I just wanted to put out is this kind of changing way that we can ask each other how we're doing. When we say to somebody, "How are you?" it's not always an indication that we really want to know deeply how someone is doing. And so I have found that during the last 18 months, when I do have time to be able to really listen, and I have the desire and I want to hear how someone is really doing, then I don't ask how they are. I try to change my wording so I indicate in some way I really want to hear. And this isn't, there's a lot of different ways of asking that. And I would love to hear what some of yours might be. I've sort of settled on often saying to people, "How are you holding up?" And sometimes I say, "I really want to know." And I've started doing this even in Zoom meetings at the beginning of business meetings, and just saying, let's take about 10 minutes and really talk about how you're holding up. Just because even in the work world, because most of it is on Zoom now, it's really uncommon that we have any of that time that happens before and after a meeting where we're really chatting with people informally about how we're doing, talking about our kids, talking about what we've been doing lately, even that sort of informal, more casual talk, and then also this sort of deeper talk. It doesn't happen anymore. So I've started trying to grab 10 minutes at the beginning and just saying, let's take some time if we can and talk. So the first thing is really just opening up a conversation with each other that indicates that we really want to hear how somebody is doing. This is one of my favorite quotes from the poet Hafiz. And I think it really speaks to this very, very deep power of listening without judgment and the power of what happens when we listen without judgment. All of us often are sort of unconsciously and consciously assessing people in front of us for whether they're judging us or not. And judging can take a lot of different forms. Sometimes judging is like implicit bias. They're unconscious beliefs we might have about the person in front of us. And that tends to make us not as useful as listeners. And people tend to pick this up. So we ourselves, if you think about when you sort of get a sense from someone that they're not really listening, or that they may have judgments about you, then what happens is we tell people a lot less. The moment we pick up any judgment at all, we tend to inhibit what we're saying, and our editor starts kind of working full time in our minds. So if somebody says to me, "How are you holding up?" And I say, it's been sort of hard lately with my son. And they say, I know, right? The pandemic, it's hard for all of us. So what are we talking about today? Then I'll immediately realize that this person maybe can't hear my struggles with my son. It's really not okay for them to hear that. They don't have the capacity. They don't have the time. They might have some judgments about what they consider complaining. I have a mom who loves me dearly, and all of her kids and her grandkids, and has a lot of judgments about what she considers complaining, which means anybody talking about anything that is wrong. And so I, don't talk with her deeply about things anymore because I don't want to be resentful of her. And so I have a relationship with her that works. But that's an example where if I had said, Dash is really struggling, she would say, yeah, I guess everyone's struggling, or struggles are good for kids, or, it would be a closing statement to end that string of conversation. So we all probably know what that feels like. And what happens is we edit the truth. So if you go to talk to your primary care physician and you say that sometimes you might be worried about how much you're drinking, and the physician, says to you, well, that's easy, then stop. then you'll know right then that you probably won't go into detail how long you've been worried about how much you're drinking, or how long or how many times you've tried to cut down or quit and haven't been successful. You sort of know that there's not the capacity for that conversation. So one of the things that we can do for ourselves and for others is to really investigate our own sort of stigma and judgment and biases, so that we can, as much as possible, as much as humanly possible, knowing that we all have judgments and biases and stigma, that we all have those, that as much as possible, we can eradicate those. So this is a picture of my dad. I grew up in Alaska. And so this is my sister and I'm on the left, I'm the smaller one. And my dad had really severe alcoholism. He died of alcoholism. And he was an immigrant from Scotland and had kind of the work ethic that often immigrants who come here at 15 without their families do. So I grew up with this, all sorts of sort of biases and judgments that I absorbed from him. And some of them might be positive in some ways, and some of them were negative. Either way, I've sort of spent my life trying to become more aware of them so I could mitigate them and be a better therapist and a better friend and a better parent, and really be there for people, a better listener. And some of them were that I grew up knowing he had alcoholism, but he believed deeply that it wasn't possible to have an addiction unless it was drugs, and he didn't believe alcohol was a drug. And so I grew up sort of thinking drugs, in quotations, are somehow deeply worse than alcohol in some way. And it seems sort of almost silly to me now, but it took a while for me to even become aware that I had that I thought sort of addiction to drugs was something very different than alcoholism, and much, much worse. I grew up thinking that hard work, how hard you worked, was equal to how good of a person you were. He really, really believed that, people who didn't work hard were bad people, and it would cause deep problems in life. And so, I was like almost 30 once I was able to sort of unwind that stigma that was making me a worse listener and a worse therapist for people who had come to me for disability forms because they were unable to work because of mental health difficulties. I had to, I was not as useful to those people. I was not as helpful until I was able to unwind that bias, that judgment. So all of us, we get them from our parents, we get them from society, we get them from our culture, from TV, from movies, from books. They come from all different places, and it is normal. We all have them. And I really, I wanted to talk about this today because to the extent that we become aware of them, and to the extent that we can sort of interrogate them ourselves, and to the extent that we can make a purposeful effort to mitigate them, to counter them, to drop them, to let them go, is really correlated directly with how helpful we can be to others in a time right now where so many people are struggling. In this piece about ourselves, those judgments and stigmas and biases are also impacting how compassionate we are with ourselves. So if I have that bias or stigma around addiction to drugs other than alcohol being worse, and if I have that around hard work being more important than my own health, for example, then the way I'm judging myself and the way I'm treating myself, is driven by those things. And so my ability to listen to myself, to take care of myself, to have self-compassion is also going to be lower as a result of those. So when we really look at those things, and when we are able to drop them, if we can, ask God to remove them, if we can't, if we, have sort of tricks in our mind to mitigate them when we're talking to somebody, it all helps ourselves as well as others. One other thing I wanted to talk about that we can do that is a very, very specific action that can help others during this time where mental health is so prevalent is that, to the extent that it matches our values and our own boundaries, because everyone is different in that way, we can share about our own mental health or substance use struggles. If we look at any given sort of group, and we sort of had people who were researching, so they were sort of coding conversations, we would see a really big percentage of people disclosing about physical health difficulties. So we would say, have people talk, how you been lately? Well, I just had a knee replacement. And I know when I got, I'm a soccer player. So I tore my ACL like every soccer player at some point. And when I was leading up to the operation and after I got the operation and afterwards, I talked about it to anybody who would listen. How are you doing? I just got my ACL replaced, and I'm in physical therapy right now. Or we talk about surgeries that we have for our hearts. Sometimes we talk about having the flu or having a cold. So it's very, very easy for us to talk about how we're doing in the context of our physical health. And if we coded that, how many times we talked about that versus how many times we shared about mental health, whether it was past, whether it was current, it would be like a 10 to 1. And it's largely around societal stigma around mental health conditions. And like I said earlier, stigma for substance use disorders is much higher, and it's going up. So when we look at public health analyses of stigma, we see that over the last 10 years, substance use disorder stigma is shooting up. Mental health stigma is coming down. It was fairly high to start with, but it is coming down over the last 10 years, which is really significant. So what happens is when we make a decision, like I said, we're all sort of different just temperamentally and our own boundaries. If you think about what I shared about my son and what I shared about my dad just today while we were talking, not everybody would feel comfortable doing that. So the reason I bring this up is sometimes the reason we don't feel comfortable doing it is because of stigma. And it's something that, we might be able to tinker with or work on. Sometimes it's just our boundaries. Like we just tend to be more private people. What I would ask everyone to ask yourself is, when we say like maybe we're private people or we don't feel comfortable sharing about our mental health, is, how does it match our comfort with sharing about our physical health difficulties? And my goal is to always try to get those things equal. If I would easily share about my ACL operation, then, could I share that, I'm really relieved because I just started taking antidepressants because after my son was adopted, I had postpartum depression. And when you adopt a child and have postpartum depression, I felt like there was a much higher stigma and I had a harder time talking about it. And so after I got professional help, after I talked to my husband about it, after I started talking to my friends about it, I was practicing telling wider groups of people when they asked how I was doing, just mentioning it, because I felt like it was one of the things I could do that in my part to lower stigma is just to start sharing about things. So it became more to do my part in it becoming more normal and more common to share about these struggles and also just getting help for these struggles. I wanted to just take us off screen share right now because I want to talk for a minute before I stop just about professional help and what we know about informal kind of self-help. What we know in the research that I suspect would be borne out by all of us here today is that only about 25% of people who have mental health struggles or substance use disorder struggles actually want professional help. Now, some of that might be stigma around it, absolutely. And some of it is just a truism that I feel like in my field, as therapists, we don't talk about very often. That's really important to talk about, which is not everybody needs professional help. They say when all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail. Sometimes I think those of us who are therapists tend to think that everybody needs, professional therapy or everybody needs professional treatment. And so I am committed to just talking about the case that, talking about the fact that that is not the case. That there's really good evidence for therapy helping people, which is fantastic. There's really good evidence for substance use disorder treatment, whether it's residential or outpatient, helps people, which is fantastic. And there's really strong evidence that there's all kinds of other interventions and things we can do for ourselves that are short of that, that are really helpful. And I'm going to name a few of them here, and then I want to stop, and I'd love to have a discussion or questions or comments to anything I've talked about today. But I don't want to end without this piece, which is what you're doing today, gathering as a group in fellowship around faith. There's incredibly good evidence about how helpful that is for mental health and substance use disorder struggles. So I just, yay, like we're all here today. I'm a member of AA. It's also a spiritual program. And like you all are today, AA went from being, you know, all online and then to a hybrid model like we're doing today. And is such important evidence that 12-step programs, which are what we would say non-professional and community oriented, are very successful for many people who have substance use disorder difficulties. Outdoor exercise, exposure to sunlight and exercise outside for at least 30 minutes a day, which I know is a lot if you're struggling with anxiety and depression. And really sometimes whether we can get ourselves outside for a walk every day or not, might be one of those lines in the sand about whether we want to seek professional help or look at medications. Because getting outside for 30 minutes every day has been shown to have the same outcomes for depression and anxiety as medications. It's really, really quite powerful. And then of course, like I said, if we can't get outside, it may be a sign for us that professional help might be needed. But those things gathering together, particularly around spiritual practices and faith-based, sharing with someone who meets us with an empathic ear, who can listen to us without giving advice. It's one of the key factors around listening is that when we give advice, it comes from a good place. It's why we give advice. We want to be helpful. It comes from a good place. It rarely is helpful. And the reason it's rarely helpful is when we're talking to someone about what we're struggling with, once they give advice, it stops feeling like they're listening and it doesn't feel like empathy. It feels like they want to fix us and not really be with us. So that empathic listening without judgment, shoulder to shoulder, really being there for somebody, with somebody, there's incredibly strong evidence that that has a powerful impact on mental health and substance use disorders, a really powerful impact. And so that's why the lay counseling ministry that you have and the work that I'm sure many of you are doing, just to sit with someone and listen and say, tell me more, tell me more, tell me more, tell me more. One of the most beautiful open-ended questions of all time. And saying back to somebody, that sounds really hard. Reflecting back, tell me more, reflecting back is a powerful, powerful intervention with lots and lots of real hard evidence about it being helpful to others and to ourselves. So let me stop. I know we have 8 or 9 minutes. I would love to hear from people if you wanted to share experiences, questions, comments. And then Jacob and or who are with those folks who are there live, please feel free if they would like to share something to facilitate that.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth, for that presentation. So yeah, we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So feel free to either raise your hand over Zoom or in the chat function, ask your question. I think we're a small enough group that we could moderate here pretty well. So go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning. Good morning.
Hi, Donna.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Really good concepts you have. Old school superintendent here. I've watched that with the kids. You're on the next. What do we do to help people know we really want to listen? I think one of the things I do with my small circle is I often say to them is, I need a story. Give me a story. And the reputation in my family is, don't you let me hear a story from somebody else. I want to hear your story. It's the old Italian thing, right? Give me a story. I need a story. And then they divert sometimes, right? They're trying to avoid, they divert and they say, oh, mom, well, what's going on in your life, right? Or brothers and sisters, well, what's going on in your life? You're not getting off that easy. No, I need a story from you. Give me a story.
I love that. I want to hear your story. Give me your story. Yeah. And then you talked about if somebody goes off like, how are you? How are you? You come back to invite them to share more. Sometimes I say to people, wait, we're not done with you yet. Like I'll share too, right? Because often people feel better in a professional therapy situation. Obviously, it makes people nervous. You don't do that, right? You're just the listener. But with our peers, with our friends, with our family, sometimes they feel better if we say, yeah, of course, I'll tell you too. I'll tell you my story too, but let's stay on you for a minute. Tell me your story. I love that.
Good work. Good work you're doing.
Others have thoughts that they want to share?
Our book group is reading A War for Kindness, a book about empathy. And a lot of what you're talking about, the willingness to listen, to be with people who are suffering in whatever manner they're suffering. There's a lot of science and a lot of evidence behind that. And I think men in particular are particularly schooled or socialized to try and fix stuff. Mm-hmm. And we really need to shut up and listen and use the two ears rather than the one mouth.
Thank you for sharing that. That book sounds amazing. I would love it if somebody, I can ask Jacob too, but if somebody would put that in the chat. And thank you for sharing that about many of us, you said maybe men more, but many of us are conditioned to fix. We feel really strongly that if someone's sharing a difficulty with us, that somehow that's an indication that they want us to fix it. And yet we know when we're on the other end of someone giving us advice, it rarely feels empathic. I'm really fascinated by the science of empathy. And it sounds like that book has a lot of it in there. I'll tell you just a couple things that are just small examples of how fascinating empathy is. When we go to a doctor and we have a wound, if we feel empathy from the doctor, from the healthcare team, from the nurse, our wounds actually heal faster than when we don't. So we know that feeling empathy from another calms our nervous systems, and it actually, our bodies biochemically respond differently to healing when we feel empathy from others. We also know that the common cold, when we go to the doctor with a common cold, depending on what we're met with, if we feel empathy for that, those symptoms are less in duration and less in severity than when we don't feel empathy. So it has a real physical impact on us. And we know that when we feel empathy from others, we share more. And so just sharing more is helpful for us. The war for kindness. Yeah, thank you for putting that in there. I'm going to read that, put that on my book list. It's really fascinating. I'll tell you, there's two or three really specific behaviors that help us convey empathy to somebody. Because feeling empathy in our hearts doesn't mean we're able to convey it. Back to my mom, who I sometimes use as an example. She has deep love and empathy in her heart for me and all of us kids and her grandkids. And yet when Dash fell down in her driveway and skinned his knees and came into her house, like crying, skinned knees, skinned hands, she said to him, "Why were you running in my driveway?" So I'm sure that's kind of funny to some of you because some of you were raised by my mom, people like my mom. Of course, she was feeling deep empathy for him. And yet this is what came out of her mouth, because I'm guessing she was so uncomfortable with seeing his pain that what came out was a judgment that this should have never happened to him. And so feeling empathy isn't the same as communicating it. And when we feel it, this deep listening is one way we can convey it, to not give advice, to listen, to say, tell me more. We can also reflect back. Gosh, what I hear you saying is you're super, super worried about your son. And sometimes you don't feel like you're the best parent to your son. Reflecting back what we hear. And then a third way is to affirm strengths, to say to somebody, gosh, I can hear how much you love your son, or I can hear how hard you're trying to take care of your health. I'm going to turn to the chat for a minute. Rebecca said, what are your suggestions when an individual feels they are not listened to? Instead of thinking from the standpoint of a bystander who can listen, I'm wondering what you can suggest for an individual who feels unheard. I hope I'm getting this right in your question, Rebecca. I hope I didn't miss this. And if I did, one thing I want to say before we have to end is Jacob has my email. I would love to hear from anybody. I would love to hear from anybody. This is the difficulty in this format sometimes. But so please, if I miss this, Rebecca, please feel free to reach out, which is what I would say to an individual who feels unheard is to keep at it until you find someone who you feel like hears you. Sometimes we're talking to somebody that we just don't feel heard. You might be talking to my mom or somebody like my mom. She's a wonderful person. She's not going to hear you. Is to find someone who will, and to keep trying until you find someone that you feel like doesn't judge you, who can really hear you. It might be professional help, or it might just be somebody else in your life who can really hear you. Not everybody can. Please don't think that the Stephen ministers are too busy for you. Don't think your story is not that big. It is for you, and we are waiting to walk with you. So it is Stephen ministers that I had contact with, that I had the honor of having contact with. And so that's Shirley is saying, or Wendy is saying, I think, to please, 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 if you feel like you need to be heard and need to be listened to, please reach out to them or to someone. It is deeply healing. Even if you think to yourself, there's no way to solve this, sometimes it doesn't need to be solved. Sometimes we need someone who can hear us and sit with us in the insolvable, to just be there and witness our difficulties, our suffering, the unsolvable pain that is in life. So I'm glad you put that in, Shirley. Yeah, Peggy said thank you. I know it's time for us to end. I really appreciate your questions and contributions and in the chat. And please don't hesitate to reach out if you'd like to by email, and we can pick up the phone. But thank you all so much for having me today. And thank you again, Jacob.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that wonderful, informative talk. And of course, yes, if you have any questions for Elizabeth, just contact Jacob, Pastor Jacob, and I'm sure he can connect you too. So, but thank you so much again, and we really appreciate you coming to join us this Sunday. Take care.
Thank you.